The slavery issue becomes a major one here as we try to understand the distress of the first century in which slavery was growing a bigger and bigger economic factor, a problem for civic order, because any slave revolt meant you had anarchy. And so the revolt of these slaves in the 70s under the leadership of Spartacus is one of the most important social events of the whole of the first century. It scared the hell out of the Roman leaders, including Crassus, who owned a lot of slaves. And the outbreak of what are called the Servile Wars, that was the third Servile War, S-E-R-V-I-L-E, the Servile War. There's three. And in the case of Spartacus, they took over southern Italy. They had an army of 70,000, and they won battles. They beat the Roman army in confrontations. The success of Spartacus scared all of Rome like nothing else ever had. And so by 70, after they put it down, they crucified 6,000 slaves in the Via Appia, along the Via Appia, on crosses. They put the cross right on each side of the road, and they strung up 6,000 of the Spartacus fighters on those crosses. And so for mile after mile after mile after mile, you drove or rode along looking at these crucified slaves. The issue of slavery in Rome is one of the most important, and you all remember, and we talked about last week, that the presence of slavery fed the gladiators, fed the culture of the gladiators. Here, the whole structure of the Colosseum included this vast underground where they could keep slave fighters and lions and bears and elephants and tigers and all the other animals that were going to come up through the trapdoors and then fight Russell Crowe. And so the world and the culture of slavery corrupted Rome. It just corrupted the whole public arena of Rome. People like Cicero denounced it all the time, Cato too, that it was morally corrupting, and it was. Of course it was. You all know it is. You know when you sit in an arena and watch two men kill each other, it's corruption. It's corrupting. And so the paradox that we talked about last week was the very two things we have in front of us, Cicero and Deiophykis, and the high values, the highest possible values of civic generosity, of responsibility, of human dignity, and on the other hand, owning hundreds of thousands of human beings being treated worse than horses, often worse than the cattle. And people like Cicero understood what a problem it all was. Here's our little chronology that we're talking about here in the first century. We know that somewhere around 100, the birth of Cicero and the rest of his generation. By the 70s, these young men, Pompey, Cicero, Crassus, have all already achieved a great deal. In the case of the generals, they have conquered territories. They're already becoming wealthy. The revolt of the slaves in 73 means that the whole structure of the republic is in danger. And between 70 and 60, this group of leaders that we've been talking about begin to undermine the republic in major ways. As they watch disorder and anarchy, they search for some way to bring about order. And so what happened was Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus sat down in secret and said, let us join together and cooperate, and together we can control the government of Rome. If we protect our three interests and block anything from any direction from anybody else, we can control the government. And that's called the first triumvirate. three men getting together and forming this secret pact to control the government. We know all about it now because we have letters, we have all kinds of inside, most of it thanks to Cicero, because Cicero tells us everything that's going on. And so by the 60s, the Republic was in danger. By the 60s, the Republic was in danger. And the actual functioning of the Republic was grinding to a halt in many ways. And then by 60 and 59, Caesar led his army into Gaul. Now this is a major change for the Roman Republic. The conquest of Gaul and the campaign in Gaul and the amount of independence that Caesar was going to have and the length of time that it went on, during which the Senate is giving him authority. He has to have it. It's being given to him from the Senate. And as they gave him that authority, he continued to march and conquer and bring areas into the Roman state with permission of the Senate. And so this all went on almost a decade. So almost from 59 down to almost 50. And so for that 10 years, the Republic, of course, is greatly expanded. The wealth of Caesar is greatly expanded. The power of the triumvirate is greatly expanded. And the Republic itself is essentially static. It's almost stopped in the road as this huge foreign policy issue unfolds, and everybody waits to see what was going to happen. So by 50, so it's 60 to 50, it's the 10 years. By 50, the state of Rome and the politics of Rome was in crisis. And the crisis emerged because this man, who had had this enormous success and had brought all of Gaul into the empire, was now to come home after all these campaigns. He wanted to come home, and his supporters wanted him to come home, but he faced a very big problem. When he came home and was relieved of his formal position, he would now revert to being an ordinary citizen of Rome. And the instant that he became an ordinary citizen and came back to Rome, he would be opened up to prosecution and suits in the courts. Any ordinary person could hire a lawyer and go down and sue him for whatever they wanted to. They could sue him for corruption. They could sue him for, alienating the affections of their wife or their sister or whatever they wanted to do. Cato had already promised the minute Caesar arrived in Rome, he was going to sue him for everything he could think of. And so Caesar in this foreign land was communicating with his supporters at home and saying, I can't come home unless someone will pass legislation that protects me from prosecution. Now, just for a moment, as American citizens, stop and think about our own headlines, which we've seen recently, about prosecuting politicians when they're out of office. It has happened. There are a number of cases. Or threats of prosecution. The lesson from Rome is don't ever do that. Don't ever do that. Don't allow the courts to begin to punish and get revenge against people who have had office, because if you do, you will break down the very structure of the republic that you love. In this case, that was exactly what Caesar's friends said in Rome. Don't do this. Don't do this. Pass a law through the Senate that says he will not be prosecuted for his actions, whether as a general or as a consul. But Cato was fanatically driven, and he insisted. And so by the time that Caesar and his army, he had a huge army that was with him and loyal to him personally, thousands of men who knew him personally. And they marched back into the Po Valley, and when they reached the line that was in Italy, and it's on your map, so you can see it right there. When they reached the line, which is about Ravenna, so, south of Venice, it's the Apennine Mountains that are right there. When they reached that line, they were about to enter into the official Roman state. The Po Valley was still not the same as the Roman state. So this was the marker. And when they reached the Rubicon, The question was, should Caesar disband his army and come alone to Rome and trust in all of the people saying, oh, well, just come, everything will be fine? Or should he not come back to Rome, which meant his career was over, retire to a villa in the south of France, which would have been nice? Or the third possibility, what? March to Rome with his army. Exactly. And with no one in Rome assuring him of immunity from prosecution, and contrary to that, many of his enemies promising they would tie him up in courts for the rest of his life, he marched with his army. And that's called crossing the Rubicon. So therefore, from 49, for the next 5 years, from 49 to 44, that's 5 years. In the next 5 years, in Rome, all of the political class of Rome, everyone who had anything to do with the government was now caught up in the personal drama of Julius Caesar. Everybody. Because he was now the most powerful man in Rome, because he had his army just outside of the capital to protect him if he needed it. He didn't bring it into the capital, but he didn't need to, because he could any minute that he needed to. And so for these next 5 years, the single biggest question that everybody faced was, what were the other triumphers going to do? Crassus was dead, so he was out of the picture, but Pompey was still very alive. So once Caesar was back in Rome, it was a question, who would prevail, Caesar or Pompey? And there's a wonderful letter in the Cicero collection that you can go and find, where Cicero writes to his friend Atticus in Athens and says, well, you know, Pompey is such a miserable failure that for us to be stuck with him is going to be very disappointing, because he's just an idiot, you know, and he doesn't know what he's doing. But we're stuck with him. In other words, Cicero was on the side of Pompey because he and his friends felt Pompey was less likely to create a dictatorship than Caesar was. But then in 48 and 47, Caesar defeated Pompey, and Pompey was killed. And so by 47, now it was even more a matter of what was Caesar going to do. And for these next few years, nobody was sure. Caesar was certainly one of the most brilliant men anybody had ever met. He was one of the handsomest men. He was one of the sexiest men. All kinds of people went to bed with him, both men and women. And rumored Mark Antony was one of them. And his second in command, his assistant. And so everybody waited. Everybody waited during 46 and 45 as to what was Caesar going to do, because he was now in a position nobody had ever been in before. He was the undisputed master of Rome. Then he went to Egypt, if you remember. Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor went to Egypt. He went to Egypt and fell in love with Cleopatra, had a son with her, and invited her back to Rome. And her visit to Rome, with her whole entourage and with thousands of black slaves carrying her throne into Rome, if you've never seen the Elizabeth Taylor version of it, you ought to rent it just for that, because it's one of the most spectacular scenes ever filmed. And in it, they show you exactly what a shock this was to Romans, that Caesar would invite this woman from Egypt into the center of Rome, implying that he might rule with her, that they would join their two empires together, Egypt and Rome, and they would be maybe king and queen of Rome and Egypt. And since everyone knew, and in fact she had the little boy right on her throne with her when she rode into Rome, everybody knew they had a little boy named Caesarion, so it wasn't like it was a secret whose little boy. There was the idea that maybe that was the future of Rome. In other words, maybe he was thinking of making himself king. Now, if there was one thing that Romans knew they didn't want, it was a king. They had been rebelling against potential kings for 400 years. In 500 BC, they had overthrown kings. They never wanted another king. And so even though Caesar was popular, and even though he gave out a lot of money, and even though he had thousands of troops who loved him, and even though he was treated almost like a god, the people of Rome did not want him to become king. At one scene, there's a very famous scene, when, and this is only a year we're talking about here, we only have like 18 months after Pompey is defeated. There's a very famous public celebration, and Caesar is seated on a throne in the forum, which itself was a bad idea, but he liked thrones, so he was up on the throne. And Mark Antony, all of this obviously pre-staged, carried in a crown, carried into the vision of the crowd a crown, and said something like, Caesar should wear this. And the crowd went absolutely silent. You had thousands of people out in the forum in front of him, and the whole crowd went silent. And so Mark Antony, obviously the two men communicating with each other, got the crown out of there really fast. But Caesar was furious. Caesar was furious. And when they were out of the public, he was raving because the crowd had obviously been so unenthusiastic about making him king. In another scene, a religious celebration, they carried in an image of him in a whole procession of images of gods. And people in the crowd booed, and he was enraged. So it's clear that in this year or so, leading to 44, the general Roman public was onto him and didn't want a king and didn't want him being the king. And so as they approached 44, late 45, there were already moves and discussions, and many discussions among Cicero's friends. You can read it all in the letters. Just after tonight, just go home and open up the letters, 45 and 44. It's all there. Everything that Cicero was saying to his friends is now for us to see. So, by early 44, remember the numbers go down as we come closer. In early 44, by January and February of early 44, a circle of the highest level of Roman leaders, like Cicero and Brutus, were talking among themselves about what to do. And in February, a plot was hatched to assassinate Julius Caesar. And for the next 3 weeks, this group of people, 20 or so, who knew each other and had lived their entire lives together, all people like Cicero, Cicero's wife, Caesar's wife, all these people knew each other. Pompey's widow met and talked about what was going to happen. And then Brutus was in the middle of the real plot that was planned for the 15th of March, the Ides of March. And so for that day, for the Ides of March, as they approached, Cicero was cut out of the conspiracy. They did this for a lot of reasons. One was protect him. They felt he was the most important man in their group, and so they wanted him not to know and not to be, to be able to say he didn't know. And of course, they probably didn't trust him. They probably weren't sure what he might do. So he didn't know. He knows immediately afterward, and then we have letters that he writes, which include letters to Brutus and about Brutus. This is a wonderful letter that Cicero writes to his friend Atticus and describes Caesar's visit to his country house, which was taking place in December of 45. So he was seeing Caesar all the time. I love just the way it starts. What a guest, he said. The story is Caesar had just sent a messenger ahead and said, can I stop at your house? I'm coming back he'd been in a boat and he'd just come on the coast, and he was on a road that went past Cicero's country house, and he just said, can I stop? Stop for a meal, stay overnight. And so Cicero, of course, said, well, yes, it would be an honor. And then he arrived with 2,000 other people. So, the letter is a wonderful description to his friend Atticus in Athens about how it all went. He said, I behaved in a civilized way. I was a civilized host, but my guest was not the kind that you say to, please do drop by on the way back. It practically bankrupted him in order to feed these people. But as you know, on the 15th of March in 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated. It happened in Pompey's theater. You can visit the remains of Pompey's theater when you're in Rome. Anybody can help you find it. It's just off the Campo dei Fiori. The reason they were meeting there was the Senate they were doing some work on the Senate, and so they just used this other nice building for a meeting of the Senate. And so Caesar came to the meeting of the Senate. As you know, I'm sure many of you read some of the great accounts. He was warned repeatedly by 3 different people that he was going to be assassinated that day. And every time he brushed it aside, there was a prophetess, a priestess that he knew well, a soothsayer on the street, a lady who would read your fortune. And she had told him repeatedly, and now he passed her, and she warned him again, that the Ides of March had come. And he said, well, yes, look, I'm okay. See, she said, well, I told you. And he said to her, but look, I'm fine. You said I'd be dead by the Ides of March. I'm fine. And went off to the theater, and the men jumped upon him, and as you can see right here, he's collapsing, and that's Brutus in the middle, who is one of the last to plunge a knife into him, and he bled to death there on the floor of the theater. In the immediate days after, in April of 44, the Roman state disintegrated. There was no one person in charge. No one knew what to do. The generals and the army waited to see what was going to happen. They were the great power. They were potentially a power. They were just outside of Rome. And the one person in the entire circle who had the power to go and command the army was Mark Antony. And so Mark Antony stepped forward, and in the form of the very famous funeral oration, here's a wonderful 19th century painting of it. And so Mark Antony steps forward and seizes power, part of it by virtue of this incredible scene in the forum where he delivers the funeral oration for his dear friend Julius Caesar. And he was his friend. But now, the power of Caesar, which had been wielded by a very, very brilliant and sophisticated and possibly idealistic man, now was handed over to a thug. Mark Antony was a tough guy. He would have done very well in the mafia. He was tough, he was strong, he was square, muscular, absolutely without scruples, didn't care at all about having people killed if it advanced his agenda. And of course, his agenda was to attain absolute power in Rome. This is exactly what he wanted to do. And so within weeks of the death of Caesar, Cicero and Brutus and their circle realized that it was worse now, that it was worse, that things had gone from bad to worse because Mark Antony was in charge and Rome was falling into chaos. There were riots, there were attacks, there were murders in the night, there were houses attacked. And so by 43, meaning 6 months or so later, all of Rome was in chaos. And as these months moved through to greater and greater chaos and the Republic disintegrated, Rome more and more talked of one man, the last man standing from this generation of these great individuals who had all been born around 100. Everybody else was gone. The only man left was Cicero. And so in these weeks, the whole circle of friends, even friends of Caesar who knew Cicero, and even friends of Pompey who had known Cicero, converged more and more and talked with him and asked what he was going to do. His best friends said, "Get out of Rome and stay out." And so his first choice was to leave Rome. And so he did. And in the months after the assassination, he wrote 5 of his greatest books. He wrote 5 different books in just those months. He worked nonstop, and that's when he wrote De Officiis. So think about that when you read De Officiis, when you think of that book on the duties. Remember, he's writing those immediately with the vision of the dead Caesar and what was going to happen to Rome. Then, by 43, by late 44 and into January, February, March of 43, the chaos increased and increased and increased. And so Cicero decided he had only one choice. He would go back. He would go back. And so early in 43, he told his friends, word in Rome spread that Cicero was coming back. This was by the summer, 43. And as he traveled on the road in a cart from the south and through the gate, that's the Via Appia, and then right up this Via San Gregorio, right exactly up this street. The Palatine's up on the left side, and the Caelian Hill and the Colosseum are right ahead of you. As he traveled down this road, thousands and thousands and thousands of Romans converged on the streets and cheered and cheered and cheered and cried and cheered and held up his books and shouted his name and said, welcome back, and we're glad you've come back. Everybody knew what it meant. Everybody knew who he was. Everybody knew what was happening, and everybody knew he was coming back to face a thug with an army, and he had none. The only thing he had were his words, and everybody knew it. Everybody knew. All his best friends said, you're doomed if you do this. And he said, I have to. I have to. I cannot not go back. And so down this street, down right to the Colosseum, right through the arch and past the Colosseum and around the Colosseum and right down the Via Sacra, which goes right down the center. And here he came, right down, thousands and thousands of Romans and 10, 20, and 30 deep on both sides of the Via Sacra, welcoming him back. Isn't it a great scene? Sends chills down your spine, doesn't it? Because everybody knew what it meant. And came right down the Via Sacra and went right into the Senate house, right here on our left of our picture. Went into the Senate and began in September of 43 to deliver what are called the second Philippics. The first Philippics is a name that came from Greece and was a series of speeches delivered against Philip, Alexander's father, by Diogenes in Athens, and so they became known as the Philippics. Now he delivered over the next few weeks a series of orations in the Senate building, which became known as the second Philippics. He gave it the title because he wanted to imply that he was delivering speeches against a tyrant. And in these speeches, he denounced Mark Antony like nobody had ever done before, and told the truth. Told Mark Antony's whole story. Scandalous, shocking details nobody had ever heard before. He told them all. And then the speeches were published. So in the next weeks, everybody in Rome could read them, and did. And all over Rome, people were running around saying, have you read the Philippics? Oh my God, what he says about Mark Antony, incredible. But of course, he was sealing his own fate. Because as the Philippics continued, Mark Antony's reputation was ruined. Mark Antony himself was raging. And by October, Cicero's life was almost at an end. After the final Philippic, and people converged and congratulated him for telling the truth and said he had inspired the Republic and he had been the savior of the Republic and he was the father of his country, he went home to his country house for a little break, and friends came running to him and said, the army is on its way. Mark Antony has sent the army to kill you. And so his servants said, we will save you, please let us get you out to the coast. So he was somewhat ill, so they loaded him on a litter and they carried him as fast as they could down to the water line. They were on the east coast, and they had a boat, but then there was a storm on this, so they had to wait. And as they waited, the army came riding down the street, horses, 100 men raging down the country road towards them. And the servant said, "We'll stay right here and we'll protect you." And he said, "No, no, 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 no. Save yourselves. There's nothing any of us can do. You get out. Run, 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 and leave me right here." And he just insisted. And so, crying, they went off, ran away, left him laying by himself on the litter. And as the horseman came up, he leaned out of the litter, and the horseman just took his sword and whacked off his head. And then, on orders from Mark Antony, they cut off his hands. The soldiers cut off his hands, the hands that had written the Philippics, and brought those hands to Rome, and on orders from Mark Antony, nailed the hands of Cicero to a post at the front door of the Senate as a statement of what one would get if one opposed the new thuggery of Mark Antony. Imagine the Romans. Imagine the vision. The hands of Cicero, who had so recently inspired them, the hands of Cicero nailed up on a post in front of the Senate building in December 43 BC.